During this time in history in the 1960s, we had the Vietnam War, started in 1955 and ended in 1975. We had great political unrest with protests by students, laborers, and civil rights groups on the Vietnam War, civil rights for Black Americans, and the women's rights movement or feminist movement. In 1968, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were killed, and just 1 year later, in 1969, we had landed on the moon. This triumph parallels the height of the industrial age. It was only natural that at this time for a conceptual art movement to arrive and question the validity of much of the art that had already been made. Artists of the 1960s questioned their own aesthetic values. They created all different types of art, often abandoning traditional means of representation. One way artists strayed from traditional means of representation was through conceptual art. Conceptual art is art that asserts the primacy of the idea. In other words, conceptualism means that the idea is the work of art. Any piece of artwork that is created in any medium that is in response to an idea is only a piece of documentation. It is a record of an aesthetic expression rather than the aesthetic expression itself. Conceptualism has roots in Dada art, particularly the art made by Marcel Duchamp. By Duchamp creating his ready-mades and placing them in a gallery setting and calling them art changed the way art was to be looked at and evaluated. It was Duchamp that formed the notion that the concept of art must come before or precede the appearance of the work. This piece here is titled 1 and 3 Chairs by Joseph Kosuth from 1965. Kosuth was an artist along with being a writer and theorist. This is one of the earliest conceptual pieces that explores language as a method of representation. Here we see an actual chair on the floor in front of a white wall, and that would be right here. Now to our left, right over here, we see a full-scale photograph of that exact chair in that exact spot. On the other side of the physical chair, to our right, right over here, is the dictionary definition of chair. These are 3 different representations of chair. This idea goes back to Plato's theory of forms that states the true form of something exists only in the idea of that thing. All representations of the idea are degraded versions. Basically, Plato starts with the premise that intellectual truth is more true than physical truth. Plato believed that all physical existence was essentially unworthy, the world of thought being far superior, and looked forward to an afterlife of pure thought. Kosuth is using a chair to show us that each representation is slightly different from the original idea. Each representation, the physical chair, the photograph of a chair, and the dictionary definition of chair are all sign systems. They are all slight misrepresentations of the original true idea of chair, which is in the creator's mind. Kosuth's 1 and 3 Chairs calls attention to the inadequacy of all sign systems. With traditional paintings, the viewer usually gets a static, cumulative experience of what the image is about. It's an all-at-once experience. Many artists were now interested in using different forms of communication in their works. Writings and verbal communication offered a sequential experience that required time to comprehend. For example, when one reads a book, it takes time to read and process its meaning. This next piece is titled The Today Series of Date Paintings by An Kawara, a Japanese artist living in New York. Kawara was focused on the passage of time. Each day he would create a small black painting with plain, simple text showing the date of that day. Each painting held the same weight and presence as the other paintings. They were all equal in the series. The full meaning is in the conception of the piece, not necessarily the piece itself. Part of conceptual art is the examination of what motivates the making, exhibiting, and selling of art. Some artists felt that the qualities held in modern art were the same qualities that fed modern commerce. Those qualities being originality, novelty, and rarity. By the 1980s, certain artworks were collected by investors, and so the artwork then became about its worth, thus losing whatever meaning it may have had at the time of the creation. In this piece titled Le Tour Visuel by Marcel Bruther, we see glasses that are all covered by the image of an eye. This work is created by mass-produced products such as glass jars, wooden discs, and magazine reproductions of an eye from a cosmetic ad. These materials reflect the impact that images of mass media and advertising had on the public and the art being created in the 1960s. This sculpture opens up a variety of questions about issues including voyeurism, identity, and desire in consumer culture. There is no front or back to the work. The eyes look out from every angle of the tower, telling us, the viewer, that there is no escape from their gaze. Bruther was against commercialism and what he interpreted as the many fashion trends in art. His work questioned the nature of art and its traditional institutions. Bruther in 1969 created a virtual museum of modern art on a Belgian beach on a North Sea coast. The floor plan was traced onto the sand. They wore museum hats and placed signs in the sand asking visitors not to touch the art. The tide, however, eventually touched the work and ultimately washed his piece away. A few years back, I was lucky enough to attend one of Hans Hock's lectures, where he discussed many of his works, both here in the States and abroad. Hock tried to promote rational thinking about the real world and its intermingled systems and organizations. He would bring to light and display their practices. Between 1957 to 1966, Hock was a member of Zero, which was an international group of artists. This group strived to reharmonize man and nature and to restore art's metaphysical dimension. They sought to organize the pictorial surface without using traditional devices. Now, if you look at the bottom here, you'll see an excerpt from 1963 poem from the three founders of Zero. And it states, "Zero is silence, zero is the beginning. Zero is round, zero spins. Zero is the moon, the sun is zero, zero is white, this desert zero, the sky above zero, the night." In the 1970s, Hock's interest in real-time systems pushed him into his criticism of social and political systems. Hock focused much of his attention on the art world and the exchanges that occurred between museums and corporations and corporate leaders. He often underlines its effects in site-specific ways. This image here is one of the best-known works and quickly became an art historical landmark. Here we see an image of Sapolsky's Manhattan Real Estate Holdings, a real-time social system as of May 1st, 1971. Hock, through his work and this particular piece, took on the real estate holdings of one of the biggest slumlords in New York City. This work exposed through actual documentation and photographs the questionable transactions of Harry Sapolsky's real estate business between 1951 and 1971. What we are looking at is only a detail of a larger piece of work. Hock was offered a solo exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum. Because he planned to include this work, which displayed the business and personal connections of the museum's trustees, his solo exhibition at the Guggenheim was canceled on the grounds of artistic impropriety by the museum's director 6 weeks before the opening. Now, Sapolsky was not a trustee, although some misunderstood the situation by assuming that he was. The curator at the time, Edward Fry, as a result, was fired for his support of the work. 10 years after his canceled exhibit from the Guggenheim, Hock included the Sapolsky's work at a solo exhibition at the New Museum of Contemporary Art. By this time, this piece was very well known. He changed the title to Hans Haack Unfinished Business. Haack wanted to inspire and stimulate people who normally wouldn't help into making an effort to change social injustices. This piece is called Situational Work by Michael Asher. Asher's situational work involved removing a wall. In 1974, Asher removed a wall that divided the exhibition and office space of a gallery. By doing this, he exposed the business operations as something worth viewing. There was nothing to look at on an aesthetic level, and there was no financial potential. Seeing as there was no work to sell, there was no money to be made. Asher did several works like this in various locations. In this next piece, we see how the placement and arrangement of art and objects can manipulate and give rise to meaning. This piece, titled Mining the Museum, is by Fred Wilson. Wilson, with permission from the Maryland Historical Society, was allowed to rearrange the museum's collection. The Maryland Historical Society was established to collect, preserve, and study objects related to the state's history. Their purpose was to include objects related to colonization, slavery, and abolition. The museum, however, presented their history from a specific viewpoint, that of its white male founding board. Wilson assembled the museum's collection in a new and unexpected way. Wilson reshuffled the museum's collection to highlight the history of African Americans. This installation juxtaposed ornate silver teacups, mugs, and pitchers with a pair of iron slave shackles. Traditionally, the display of arts and crafts are kept separate from the display of traumatic artifacts such as slave shackles. By displaying these artifacts together, Wilson makes apparent the link between the two kinds of metalworks. The production of the one was made possible by the subjugation enforced by the other. Wilson's Mining the Museum calls attention to the museum's exercise of cultural power. In this close-up, we can see the ornate silver teacups, mugs, and pitchers with a pair of iron slave shackles that are right in the center right there. This piece is titled TV Bra for Living Sculpture by Namjoon Paik. For this piece, Paik took his interest in technology, particularly video and television sets, and fused them with music. He saw the TV sets with their screens, wires, and antennas as sculptural elements which could produce endless visual and auditory experiences. Here we see Charlotte Moorman playing the cello while wearing two miniature TV sets in place of her bra. Paik is quoted as saying, "TV brassiere for living sculpture, Charlotte Moorman, is one sharp example to humanize electronics and technology. By using TV as bra, the most intimate belonging of the human being, we will demonstrate the human use of technology and stimulate viewers, not for something mean, but stimulate their fantasy to look for the new, imaginative, and humanistic ways of using our technology." This is a fun image titled Self-Portrait as Fountain by Bruce Nauman. Here Bruce Nauman is a living pun of Duchamp's fountain, and we can see Duchamp's fountain right in the upper left corner here. Like Duchamp, Nauman questioned the tradition of art. Nauman was a diverse artist who made paintings, prints, sculptures, and video art. He was more interested in the possibility of what art could be rather than adding his work to a collection of things that are just art. Nauman was one of the first artists to really experiment with videos as an art form. He has filmed himself in his early years, often in his empty studio, doing mundane but odd things. One film is over an hour long, titled Lip Sync, where he films the bottom portion of his face upside down, and all he says for an hour is lip sync, over and over again, as the viewer looks at his chin and lips. It's amusing and exhausting, as is his other video called Walking in Contrapposto, also known as Walking in a Strange Manner, where he walks around a square, tilting his hip up as he takes each step. Now here you can see a couple stills from the two videos I just talked about. This is walking in contrapposto, or walking in a strange manner, and then you can see how he's moving his hip funny and how he's walking along the square in his studio. And then the top one to the right here, the lip sync. You can imagine watching this for an hour, where it's just his chin upside down with his mouth saying lip sync over and over again. In this piece titled Violins, Violence, Silence, Nauman places these neon words forwards, backwards, and in reverse, forcing the viewer to read the words and try to comprehend a meaning that becomes jumbled and confusing. The letters soon become unfamiliar, and the viewer eventually sees abstract shapes. This artist, Peter Campus, made a series of short videos in the early 1970s. This one is titled 3 Transitions from 1973. He uses himself as the performer and explores different ideas of self-transformation. In the end, he metamorphosizes himself using his face, which is the most identifiable part of his body. These 3 transitions are philosophical metaphors for the psychology of the self. Campus tries to articulate his transformations as internal and external selves, blending illusion and reality. In this image, we see Marina Abramovic and Ulay in Rest Energy from 1980. Ulay was Abramovic's emotional and professional partner for 12 years. This image shows the two facing each other wearing almost identical clothing. They are both holding the bow and balancing themselves with it. Abramovic holds the handle of the bow, having the arrow pointed directly at her heart, while Ulay holds the string that is pulled back. The arrow has been notched. So if we look, we see Abramovic and Ulay, and she is holding the head of the bow, and the arrow is pointed at her, and he is holding the string, pulling it back, and they're balancing each other off of this. The strain of the arrow against the weight of their bodies causes them to tremble and gasp at their effort to control the arrow and prevent it from releasing into Abramovic's heart. Microphones were placed on their chest to amplify the sound of their heartbeats. This performance lasted over 4 minutes. During this time, their heartbeats became more rapid, giving the performance a powerful tension. Abramovic's primary medium is her body. This next image is of a performance given by Vito Acconci titled Seedbed from 1972. During this performance, Acconci spent several hours underneath a gallery-wide ramp masturbating, while fantasizing through a loudspeaker about the people walking above him. And if we look here, here's a slanted floor. There's like a little ramp under there, and this is where he was lying, was right under there. As visitors entered the gallery, they would not see him, but they would hear him perform his act. By performing this intensely personal activity, Acconci was introducing the element of personal risk into his work by making himself vulnerable to the visitors of the gallery and possibly alienating the audience. Acconci's Seedbed compared sexual vulnerability to artist vulnerability. Here, Vito Acconci made a sculpture that would perform when initiated by the viewer. This piece is called Instant House from 1980. When the viewer walks towards the sculpture, all the pieces are lying flat on the floor with a swing suspended from the ceiling in the center. So if we look, this person here is the viewer. It's an interactive piece. So this person comes in and they sit down, and what happens when the person sits down is the swing triggers pulleys that pull up the walls to form a small structure, which is what we see over here. The viewer on the swing is now surrounded by American flags. Viewers on the outside see the red Soviet flag with the hammer and sickle. This piece for Acconci was directed to the disturbing connotations of the Cold War. Gilbert and George were two men who transformed themselves into living sculpture. They were formal in their appearance and adopted the slogan, "Art for All." This piece here, titled "The Singing Sculpture," was performed while they were still students. The two covered their heads and hands in multicolored metallized powders. They stood on a table and sang along to a recording of Flanagan and Allen's song, "Underneath the Arches," sometimes for a day at a time. They wore their suits as if they were uniforms, and it was unusual for one to be seen without the other. They were publicly inseparable. Gilbert and George refused to separate their art from their everyday lives. They insisted that everything they do is art. They created what they called living sculpture. This piece is from the feminist art program titled "Woman House, Detail of Linen Closet." The feminist art program was founded by Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro. It was one of the first organized efforts to create feminist art. One of the largest installations during the 1970s was Woman House. There were several domestic rooms in the installation. This particular image depicts the linen closet. The shelves and drawers in the closet have trapped a woman and is now defining her life. This large installation inspired female artists to take risks and experiment in different mediums and formats. This is by Judy Chicago and is titled "The Dinner Party." It is a white tiled floor inscribed in gold with 999 women's names. The triangular table is painted porcelain. On the triangular table are sculpted dinner plates and needlework. The dinner plates have sculpted themes of female genitalia. This work comments on how women are defined by their anatomy, and as some of the female forms turn into phallic-like images, there's an implication of empowered females. This was a very controversial piece when it was created. Critics of the dinner party have said that the plates are essentializing, meaning that they extract the essence from the female by giving it a dual identity. Sylvia Sleigh was a British realist painter who responded to the feminist movement by creating paintings that showed a reversal of roles. This painting, titled "Imperial Nude," is comparable to Manet's Olympia. Here, Sleigh is also challenging the tradition of the nude model, which up until now was reserved for females. Some of you may have heard of the Guerrilla Girls. They formed in 1985 and were a group of anonymous feminists who would never reveal their identities. When in public, they would wear gorilla masks. They covered the streets and buses with posters and flyers that looked like public service announcements. This group was unhappy at the small number of women that were represented in museums and galleries. They claimed that the $17.7 million spent to purchase a Jasper Johns piece could have been used to purchase 67 works by major female artists. These artists include Artemisia Gentileschi, Mary Cassatt, Frida Kahlo, and Georgia O'Keeffe. This early poster sums up their opinion nicely, and I'm just going to read it straight from the screen here. The advantages of being a woman artist: working without the pressure of success, not having to be in shows with men, having an escape from the art world in your 4 freelance jobs, knowing your career might pick up after you're 80, being reassured that whatever kind of art you make, it will be labeled feminine, not being stuck in a tenured teaching position, seeing your ideas live on in the works of others, having the opportunity to choose between career and motherhood, not having to choke on those big cigars or paint in Italian suits, having more time to work when your mate dumps you for someone younger, being included in revised versions in art history, not having to undergo the embarrassment of being called a genius, getting your picture in the art magazines wearing a gorilla suit. This mural is called "The Great Wall of Los Angeles" by Judy Baca. This political figurative mural is one of the largest murals in the world, spanning over 1.5 miles. Judy Baca began this project in 1976 and finished it in 1983. The mural is filled with different cultural stories and political struggles. The images respond to local issues as well as citywide concerns. Stylistically, the Great Wall of Los Angeles is reminiscent of the Mexican muralists. This image shows a better example of the environment and the setting and the size and scope of this mural, the Great Wall of Los Angeles. This last image we are going to look at is by Robert Colescott. Colescott was the first African American that represented the United States at the Venice Biennale. This painting is titled George Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware, page from an American history textbook from 1975. Colescott's primary subject matter was racial stereotypes. This painting is a clear example of that. This is a comment on race and history in America. His work is painted in a raw, almost cartoonish manner. He paints in flat acrylic paint. Here we can see the takeoff or spoof of the original painting. The original painting is right up here, right above my head there. In this version, Colescott replaces Washington with the agricultural scientist Carver, who stands as Washington did at the front of the boat. So here's Washington at the front of the boat, and here's Carver. Now, George Washington Carver, was an American educator, scientist, inventor, and botanist. He was born into slavery in Missouri in the early 1860s. He was so respected that Time magazine in 1941 dubbed Carver a Black Leonardo. Around Carver, we see his crew of servants who are obviously put in the picture for their historically racist popular imagery. In the top left corner, there is a stencil lettering, and it is the beginning of the title right up there. Okay? George Washington Carver crosses the Delaware is what it says, which serves as an explanatory and identifying caption similar to those found on postcards or published illustrations. Colescott is quoted as saying, "Unfortunately, stereotypical images are part of American heritage. I had to come to terms with that for myself, ultimately controlling the images by making them say some things for me." He has brought to surface the exclusions of the past and has stated that it is not about race, but about perceptions.